The craft had to accommodate comfortable living spaces for a complement of 160, who could be submerged for as long as 120 days under normal conditions, otherwise austere in amenities. The Typhoon ships gave the engineers at St. Petersburg's Rubin Design Bureau room to include unprecedented perks. Their sheer size even made it possible to squeeze in a solarium, a swimming pool, and a sauna. The SSBM missiles were designed by the McAvee Design Bureau, and were given the NATO designation, SS-20 Sturgeon. Each missile consisted of 10, independently targetable multiple reentry vehicles MIRVs and weighed 84,000 kilograms at launch, carrying 100 kiloton nuclear warheads. The Ohio-class submarines are able to carry 102 nuclear warheads of 100 kilotons each, and the Typhoon class would also carry 20 RSM-5 to intercontinental three-stage ballistic missiles. Unsurprisingly, the Soviets aimed to give their missiles enhanced range. To accommodate the improved variant, Soviet SLBMs had to be substantially larger and heavier than their Western counterparts. In truth, the Sturgeon is more than twice as heavy as the UGM-96 Trident I and remains the heaviest SLBM to have ever served. As such, the vessel had to be scaled accordingly. Their guidance system was inertial with stellar reference updating, and their range stretched to 8,300 kilometers, enabling them to easily target the United States with an accuracy of 500 meters. Besides the missiles, the class included 6 torpedo tubes for 630 mm tubes and to 533 umph tubes for a total of 22 anti-submarine projectiles of varying types, such as the Type 53 torpedo and the RPK-2 missile. Moreover, Typhoons could fire their primary weapon system and deploy their I-39 SLBMs while moored at their docks, making them a significantly powerful platform. The origin of NATO's reporting name for the class is unclear. It is said that the word Typhoon was used by General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev of the Communist Party back in 1974, when describing the new type of nuclear ballistic missile submarine, in reaction to the U.S. Navy's Ohio baptizing the entire fleet. The Soviet SSBM design features a multi-hole layout with no less than 5 inner holes. These were situated inside a superstructure comprising 2 parallel main halls, which were coated with sound-absorbent tiles. In the center, a third smaller hall above the main halls protruded just below the sail. This characteristic significantly increased the Typhoon's menacing appearance, since their sail or conning tower did not conceal the missile silos and their imposing masts were always visible in pictures. The multiple pressure holes simplified the internal design, but made the ship notoriously wider than average submarines. However, they also increased the overall survivability of the vessel. If any pressure hole was breached, the crew in the adjacent hull was safer and at less risk of flooding. Furthermore, the design included ice-breaking features as well as technology for traveling under the ice. The submarines also showcased an advanced stern fin, horizontal hydroplanes, and retractable nose horizontal hydroplanes. Additional retractable gear included 2 periscopes and masts for radio communications, navigation, and direction finding. Consequently, the type was able to dive as deep as 400 meters and reach a maximum submerged speed of 25 knots. By contrast, its cruising speed was 12 knots. Most importantly, the type was unquestionably larger than its American competitor. Although the Typhoons were only 17 feet longer than the Ohio class, they were substantially wider and taller. In total, Russia built 6 Typhoons between 1976 and 1985. The ships were initially designated by hull numbers only, but the 4 vessels retained by the Russian Navy and sponsored by either a city or a company later received proper names. The class's lead ship, TK-2, was later named Dmitry Donskoy and entered service in 1981, followed by TK-200 to TK-213, Arkhangelsk and others. In 1989, the construction order for a 7th vessel, TK-2-210, was cancelled and never completed. There was an initiative in the early 1990s to refurbish some of the submarines into cargo vessels for shipping oil, gas and other materials. exploiting the type's inherent under-ice capabilities to reach far-flung northern territories. The colossal ships could take up to 10,000 tons of cargo and ship it with relative ease under the ice in the Barents Sea. Still, the oil could only be delivered around the world after the considerable engineering process to transfer it from the drilling platforms to the submarines and then to waiting tankers was fully functional. The class was stationed with the Russian Northern Fleet only. Dmitry Donskoy received a refit and was relaunched in 2002 as a trial ship. As for Kul and Seversk, they were decommissioned between 2004 and 2006 and placed in reserve, while their sisters TK-208 and TK-13 were ultimately scrapped in 2011. The Defense Ministry decided to write off all Project 941 submarines 3 years later, as Russia faced several restrictions as part of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. They were to be replaced by the Bore class. The United States assisted in the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, which had nuclear fuel removed from -208 Takas in US-funded processing facilities. She was then converted for long-term storage and reuse, and the UK also took part in the process. Dmitry Donskoy spent her war career as a testbed for a new generation of Russian submarine technologies and was transferred to the Baltic to participate in the 2017 main naval parade held in KRONSTATT. As the behemoth that she is, the submarine was instrumental in testing the next intercontinental ballistic missile in the Russian Navy's inventory, the solid-fueled Bulava RSM Lima Pulina. The older R-39 was retired. Reportedly, the Bulava has a range of over 8,000 kilometers, but unlike its predecessor, it can carry a 550 kiloton nuclear warhead based on the land-launched Topol missile. The weapon was intended to arm the newer Bore class, but was also retrofitted to the Typhoon. The Navy eventually cancelled the Typhoon modernization program, arguing that upgrading a single vessel in the class would be as expensive as building two new Bores from scratch. As such, Russia also eliminated the last R-39 SLBMs. The only Typhoon in active service was outfitted with the more modern RSM-56 Bolivar and continued in operation until 2022. It was previously stated that the submarine would remain in service until 2026 in her role as a weapons test platform, but there are conflicting reports. Some say she was decommissioned in July, while other sources claim a final decision on her fate would not be taken until late 2022. The newer Bore-class vessels are replacing the aging Typhoons, with a fleet of at least 8 submarines allocated between the Northern and Pacific fleets, armed with 16 Bolivar missiles, each hore a total explosive yield of 7,200 kilotons per submarine. Bores are nonetheless shorter than their predecessors, at around 170 meters, and the new submarines are considerably more spacious. Not to mention that the Bolivar is expected to be much more accurate than older missiles. Ultimately, the new submarines were designed to reduce the cost of building and maintaining the colossal Typhoons. The 4-decade-old Dmitry Donskoy is soon to be retired. Born in an age before compact computers and modern ballistic missiles existed, her size was a byproduct of a time when missiles were enormous, not only because of the available technology but also because of the materials and engineering approaches of the period, because they seemed more menacing. As weapons became smaller and more accurate, there might never again be a class of submarines as large as the Typhoon, but that remains to be seen. During the Cold War, the US Navy launched the infamous Operation Ivy Bells to spy on the Soviets, and the legendary USS Halibut was chosen for the mission. Not everyone supported the idea. Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, not part of the Navy's intelligence network, set out to create his own specialized submarine, NR-1, designed to perform deep-sea tasks. NR-1 carried advanced computer and sonar systems and a suite of tools for recovery, exploration, and research. Although marketed as a rescue submarine, she was primarily used for covert missions. She conducted search operations, object recovery, and oceanographic research, and for a time held the title of the smallest nuclear submarine in US military history. The Navy's plan to tap Soviet undersea communications cables relied on the assumption that physical cable links were secure. Many Soviet messages were not encrypted, so intercepting the lines provided direct intelligence. Operation Ivy Bells proved highly successful, with USS Halibut supplying valuable insight into Soviet submarine operations. Rickover, skeptical of the Halibut project and excluded from its intelligence loop, collaborated with John P. Craven, the Navy scientist who worked on Halibut modifications to develop a different kind of vessel. Rickover envisioned a fleet of small subs that could perform search and rescue tasks, recover objects from depth, and carry out scientific research, while avoiding classification as warships so they would operate with less bureaucratic oversight. Out of that initiative, NR-1 was born. NR-1 was a unique, deep submergence vessel. She lacked formal commissioning and carried an unusual designation that emphasized her link to the Navy's reactor program. Unlike Halibut, NR-1 did not rely on divers for deep tasks. Instead, she used hydraulic manipulator arms because the depths she reached were beyond human diver limits. Her hull required extreme precision in construction to withstand immense underwater pressure. Even a slight deviation from a perfectly circular cross-section could be catastrophic. Because of her deep diving capabilities and the substantial expense involved, NR-1 was conveniently marketed to the public as a rescue submarine, a cover that made it easier to secure funding. Deep-sea rescue was a legitimate need, and taxpayers were more willing to fund technologies that might save lives. Even though NR-1 was not ideally suited for conventional rescue work, she was painted in bright colors and presented as a Chandrascu vessel to reinforce that image. The NR-1 project ran concurrently with Halibut and competed for the same funding and talent, but the two programs were administratively separate. Halibut operated under naval intelligence on the west coast, while NR-1 fell under Rickover's direction on the east coast, so their paths rarely crossed. NR-21 was constructed by General Dynamics Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut. Small by submarine standards, she measured roughly 45 meters in length and displaced about 400 long tons. She required a single nuclear reactor and a turbine generator, had 2 propellers and 4 ducted thrusters, and could make only a few miles per hour, so she was often towed to sea by a surface vessel. Despite her size and speed limitations, NR-1 was well equipped. She carried sophisticated computers and sonar, a recovery claw, 3 viewports, a basket for depositing recovered items on the seafloor, bottoming wheels for driving along the seabed, exterior lighting, TV, and still cameras, and a manipulator with cutting and gripping tools. Nuclear power gave NR-1 a crucial advantage. She did not need atmospheric oxygen and could remain submerged far longer than conventional subs. In practice, endurance was limited by basic constraints such as waste, storage, so missions typically ran up to about a month. Crew size was small, around 10 to 13 people, and accommodations were austere. Basic cooking facilities were minimal. Meals were often frozen. Bathing was infrequent, and oxygen was supplemented with chemical oxygen candles. Rickover insisted that crew be drawn from the top, graduates of the Navy's elite nuclear power school, to ensure technical competence and reliability. NR-1's nuclear plant was a marvel of miniaturization and simplification. Compared with traditional naval reactors, it was compact and required limited shielding to save weight. Plans to build additional deep submergence vessels were shelved by budget constraints, and NR-1 was never formally commissioned, yet she served around the world for decades. Her missions included search and recovery, geological and oceanographic surveys, and installation and maintenance of undersea equipment. NR-21 could hold position and map or search areas with great precision. She could operate along the seafloor at depths far beyond fleet boats, though still shallow compared with average ocean depths. The bottoming wheels let her roll along the seabed at close range, while powerful floodlights revealed wreckage or objects of interest. Crew members would peer through small portholes to inspect the seafloor, and items could be retrieved with the hydraulic arm and stowed in a retractable cage. Beyond being Rickover's personal project, NR-21 had a covert, clandestine purpose. The Navy's special mission ships carried out remarkable intelligence operations, and NR-1 played a discreet but important role in that shadowy work. Many of NR-1's missions were initially kept secret, but have since gained renewed attention. However, several of the submarine's operations remain shrouded in mystery. During the 1970s and 1980s, NR-1 undertook numerous classified recoveries from the deep sea floor. One confirmed mission occurred in October 1976, when NR-1 was deployed to locate and recover a U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcat resting about 1,960 feet underwater after it slipped off the deck of USS John F. Kennedy. Decade later, NR-1 helped conduct seabed surveys that supported the investigation into the Challenger space shuttle disaster, searching for and retrieving vital shuttle parts. In October 1994, NR-1 surveyed an area of the Florida Straits about 65 kilometers southwest of Key West and unexpectedly discovered an uncharted sinkhole. That feature was later named NR-1 by an advisory committee in December 1998. In 1995, the explorer, Robert Ballard, used NR-1 and her support ship, MV Caroline Show, to examine the wreck of HMH, the Titanic's sister ship, which had sunk off Greece during World War I after a long and secretive career. NR-1 was retired in 2008. Parts of the craft went on display at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton in 2013. Former crew members, bound by secrecy, have only been able to share limited stories, but they emphasize how unique and compelling life aboard NR-1 could be. On the morning of 12 August 2000, during the Russian Navy's large summer exercise in the Barents Sea, the Oscar, the second-class submarine K-141 Kursk, vanished while conducting a practice torpedo launch. Kursk carried an experienced crew of 118. She had been cleared to fire to dummy torpedoes in a drill involving the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov and other surface units. At about 11:29 a.m., an underwater explosion was detected, and roughly 2 minutes later, a much larger blast was recorded. Seismic stations around the world registered the The international community promptly offered assistance, but Russian authorities initially declined foreign help. Although an immediate rescue may ultimately have been impractical, confusion, poor communication, and organizational problems within the Navy and government delayed an effective response and contributed to the loss of Kursk and her crew. The full truth behind those tragic hours only emerged years later. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had invested heavily in weapons designed to counter large U.S. surface formations, especially aircraft carriers. One result was Project 949A, the Oscar II-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine NATO, Oscar II, powered by two OK-650 reactors, and built for high-speed and long-range strike. These huge boats carried large anti-ship missiles and were intended to hunt carrier groups. An Oscar II could carry up to 24 P-700 Granite NATO, SSN-19 shipwreck cruise missiles, each a large airplane-sized weapon, roughly 33 feet long, and weighing on the order of several thousand pounds. The Granite could fly at high subsonic to supersonic speeds, and had a long range, and it could be armed with either a heavy conventional warhead, or a very large nuclear warhead. About 20 boats were planned, but ultimately, only a portion of that number were completed. K-141 Kursk was one of the later boats, delivered in 1994, and entering service with the Northern Fleet. The design represented the apex of light Soviet submarine engineering and for a time was a point of pride for the Russian Navy. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian Navy suffered severe budget cuts that affected maintenance and readiness. On the 12th of August 2000, dozens of vessels took part in a major exercise above the Arctic Circle called Submarine, including Kursk, Admiral Kuznetsov, and several cruisers and destroyers. Kursk had recently earned commendations and was regarded as among the Northern Fleet's more capable submarines. Although the exercise was a training event, Kursk carried a full complement of conventional weapons and a trained crew of 118. During a simulated attack, she requested permission to conduct a torpedo training launch, which was granted. The missile room crew loaded a Type 65 torpedo into tube number 4 on the starboard side. The weapon, without a warhead, was still a heavy, large piece of ordnance. Shortly after the first detected explosion, a second, far more powerful blast rocked the area and produced seismic signals that were picked up by arrays from Norway to Alaska. Crews on nearby vessels initially assumed the events were part of the exercise. A hydroacoustic signal and hull vibrations alerted some commanders that something was wrong. Early radio messages reportedly went unanswered or were ignored, and several hours passed before a coordinated search and rescue effort was mounted. A helicopter and rescue ship were dispatched, then aircraft, and by the evening the Northern Fleet had declared a state of emergency and halted the exercise to concentrate on the search. Offers of international assistance from the United States, Britain, France, Norway, and others were made, but Russian officials were slow to accept foreign help. Confusion and conflicting statements followed. Families at the base exchanged rumors, while officials alternately downplayed the incident, claimed contact with the submarine, or described minor technical difficulties that forced the vessel to the seabed. The president, who was on vacation, was notified after a delay, and the handling of the crisis attracted domestic and international criticism. In the aftermath, the Navy and government proposed a range of explanations for the disaster. Some officials initially blamed an external collision. Others suggested a World War II mine, and still other theories pointed to an accident with one of Kursk's torpedoes. Over time, independent inquiries, survivor testimony recovered later, and declassified material have provided a clearer picture. But for many months, the true sequence of events was contested and obscured by misinformation, bureaucracy, and grief. They were all wrong, but the truth would not emerge for a while. A week after the incident, President Putin finally acknowledged that outside help was needed and authorized British and Norwegian specialists to join the effort. The divers knew there was no hope of finding survivors, but their spirits were crushed when they found the flooded rescue chamber. When they cut it open, they discovered only dust, ashes, and badly burned human remains. On August 21st, the fate of Kursk and her 118 sailors was announced on television. Admiral Popov addressed the nation and said, "Forgive me for not bringing back your boys." August 23rd was declared a day of mourning, and 3 days later, Putin posthumously awarded the title Hero of Russia to the submarine's commander and the Order of Courage to the 117 sailors who had been lost. Kursk rested on the seafloor until September 26, 2001, when she was raised to continue the investigation. Unfortunately, the bow section had to be cut away and left behind, and some primary evidence was lost. The full truth came out in the summer of 2002. An old torpedo had leaked hydrogen peroxide, an obsolete and dangerous propellant that had long been banned by others, and faulty welding on that torpedo caused the first explosion, which then detonated the remaining ordnance on board. Other factors made the disaster worse. A disabled rescue buoy, missed inspections, mishandling of delicate equipment, and systemic neglect. 23 sailors survived the initial explosions by sheltering in the 9th compartment, but they could not escape. Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov managed to write 2 notes under the wreck's poor lighting, explaining that the survivors decided not to attempt an escape because they could not survive the pressure changes and believed rescue was still possible. They endured for hours in the freezing wreck, and even tried to recharge the oxygen generation system. But that effort triggered a chemical explosion and flash fire that consumed the remaining oxygen. Russian Navy officials deemed responsible for the botched response were removed, fired, or reassigned. The episode was a harsh lesson for Russia, but it still took years before the Defense Ministry launched a major modernization program to renew its aging fleet. Originally a World War II-era light freighter, USS Pueblo was later recommissioned by the U.S. Navy as an environmental research ship that carried 2 civilian oceanographers on some missions, a cover for her real role as an intelligence-gathering vessel. Pueblo monitored foreign signals and relayed findings via a parabolic antenna. On January 23, 1968, Pueblo was conducting routine surveillance off the North Korean coast when she was intercepted by patrol boats that trained their guns on her and demanded surrender. With capture inevitable, the crew stalled while destroying classified material, even as they came under fire. The U.S. Navy maintained that Pueblo had stayed in international waters, roughly 16 miles offshore, but North Korea claimed otherwise. The incident threatened to spark a major international crisis. In January 1968, Pueblo sailed from a base in Japan with orders to collect intelligence on North Korean coastal radars and radio stations, capable of only about 15 miles per hour, and ordered to remain at least 12 miles from shore. She was lightly armed. The mission was uneventful until she encountered a small North Korean subchaser on January 20th, and then to fishing trawlers 2 days later. On January 23rd, a second subchaser closed at speed and challenged the ship's nationality. Captain Lieutenant Commander Lloyd Bucker notified U.S. authorities and maintained that Pueblo was in international waters. Raising the American flag when challenged, the North Korean vessel replied, "Heave to, or I will fire," and continued to close. Soon MiG-21 fighters and multiple torpedo boats surrounded Pueblo. Bucker ordered full speed east to evade boarding, but the North Koreans opened fire, wounding the commander. Pueblo's only visible armament consisted of 2.50 caliber machine guns that were unloaded and covered. The crew scrambled to destroy classified documents but had only 2 paper shredders and a small incinerator. As Pueblo slowed and then stopped just before entering the waters, North Korea claimed as territorial. Enemy fire resumed and 1 sailor was killed. 2 hours after the engagement began, North Korean forces boarded the ship, bound and blindfolded the 82-person crew, and took them to Pyongyang. The crew was accused of spying inside North Korea's claimed 12-mile territorial limit and imprisoned. The Pueblo incident became the most serious crisis in a period of heightened tensions with North Korea. The United States always maintained that Pueblo had been sailing in safe international waters, and U.S. officials demanded the release of the captured sailors. Meanwhile, tensions on the Korean peninsula escalated. On January 31st, more than 24 infiltrators came within 109 yards of the South Korean presidential residence in an apparent assassination attempt before being met with gunfire. South Korean officials feared further attacks across the demilitarized zone and even threatened to withdraw South Korean troops from Vietnam. The war in Vietnam was also heating up as North Vietnamese forces launched preliminary attacks that would culminate in the Tet Offensive, a massive campaign some 2,000 miles south of Korea. President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered a military buildup in the region rather than direct retaliation. The Pueblo crew at first refused to sign false confessions. They were moved to another compound in the countryside, forced to study propaganda, and harshly punished for rule violations. During a staged propaganda photograph, the men famously raised their middle fingers at the camera, later explaining it was an ironic good luck gesture. At a later fake news conference, the prisoners were ordered to praise their treatment, but many inserted sarcasm and innuendo in their statements. The captors responded with cold, sleep deprivation, and other brutal measures. Captain Lieutenant Commander Lloyd Bucker resisted signing a confession for months, declaring he would never be party to a disgraceful act of aggression, but after prolonged mistreatment, he and the crew ultimately signed the coerced STATEMENTSUS. Diplomats spent months negotiating at Panmunjom. Talks were hampered because the U.S. negotiator had to read pre-approved talking points and was not allowed to improvise. North Korea insisted it would return only the crew in exchange for a signed apology, admitting guilt and promising never to spy again. After careful negotiation, U.S. negotiators agreed to sign a document with the understanding it would be retracted once the crew was safely back on American soil. On December 23, 1968, 11 months after Pueblo's capture, the crew crossed the bridge of no return and walked home one by one. Washington promptly withdrew the apology, and the men were hailed as heroes. Captain Bucker, however, faced a Navy court of inquiry because some senior officers believed he had violated an unwritten naval rule by not defending the ship. Navy Secretary John Chaffee ultimately decided not to press charges, saying the men had suffered enough. Pueblo had carried a number of top-secret encryption machines and codebooks. It is believed North Korea transferred much of that equipment to Moscow, where Soviet technicians exploited it to intercept U.S. naval communications until American systems were upgraded. U.S. officials initially assumed the seizure was ordered from the top in Moscow, but declassified archives later showed Soviet commanders were caught by surprise and feared the incident could trigger a full-scale war. Regardless, the Soviet Union benefited from the intelligence windfall. Many of Pueblo's crew suffered long-term physical and psychological effects. Survivors later formed a website to share their experiences, successfully lobbied for recognition as prisoners of war, and even sued North Korea in U.S. courts. Pueblo itself remains in North Korean custody, moored on the Taedong River in Pyongyang as an exhibit at the victorious Fatherland Liberation War Museum. Because she was never formally decommissioned, Pueblo remains one of the oldest commissioned vessels associated with the U.S. Navy, second only to USS Constitution. In the 1980s, the Soviet Navy produced a vessel that would become a symbol of a crumbling regime. When the USSR collapsed and Ukraine declared independence, Kyiv initially retained control of the unfinished flagship. Admiral Kuznetsov was not a conventional aircraft carrier, but a heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser, designed to support missile-equipped aircraft, submarines and surface ships. Development was badly affected by the Soviet breakup. The ship was forced to travel thousands of miles incomplete, and the post-Soviet Russian government lacked the resources to maintain her properly. Still, the Kremlin was reluctant to relinquish such a prized asset, and quietly plotted to retrieve her from Ukraine. Soviet planners had once dreamt even bigger. In the 1960s, they considered an 85,000-ton nuclear-powered carrier to carry 60 to 70 aircraft. But that proved impractical. The more modest project, 11435, produced a conventionally propelled ship, and Western observers speculated about combined nuclear and steam plants intended to operate with catapult-launched Su-27K fighters and Yak-44 AU aircraft. Laid down in 1983 and launched in 1985, the first hull carried several names in succession initially, then Leonid Brezhnev, then Tbilisi for finally being christened Admiral Kuznetsov. By 1989, she was roughly 71% complete and nearly ready for flight trials. But she was never officially called an aircraft carrier. The designation aircraft-carrying cruiser was politically important because it allowed passage through the Turkish Straits. Otherwise, a Black Sea-built carrier would have been trapped there. In the autumn of 1991, Ukraine's declaration of independence heightened tensions over the Black Sea Fleet, complicated by many officers' pro-Russian sympathies and the fallout from the failed August coup after Ukraine declared independence. Newly appointed President Leonid Kravchuk sent a telegram declaring Admiral Kuznetsov Ukrainian property, so the ship was ordered to remain in Sevastopol until Kyiv decided her fate. Moscow wanted the vessel returned, but the ship's commander argued that Ukraine was not yet a constituted state. A deputy commander of the Northern Fleet arrived from the Arctic to preempt the Ukrainian government, and on December 1st, the day elections were held for independence. The Northern Fleet ordered the unfinished carrier to leave the Black Sea immediately. Admiral Kuznetsov departed the shipyard manned by roughly one-third of her original crew, while the remainder stayed behind. Despite being incomplete and destined for a port with limited infrastructure, she ultimately became the Russian Navy's flagship. Kuznetsov's design served a different mission than U.S. carriers. Classified as a heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser, she was intended to support and defend strategic missile submarines, surface ships and missile-carrying aircraft, and to provide protection against hostile ASW aircraft. Her flight deck is approximately 14,700 square meters and uses a 12 ski jump at the bow instead of steam catapults. The absence of catapults limits the use of heavy strike loads. Fixed-wing aircraft must accelerate with afterburners and lift off from the ski jump, and airframes must avoid stalling at relatively low clearance. Speeds of 120 to 140 kilometers per hour The flight deck includes arrestor wires and 2 starboard lifts to move aircraft between hangar and deck. Although the ship was originally intended for supersonic Su-27K fighters and heavier types, in practice, she has most often deployed Su-33s, MiG-29Ks, and trainer variants. Kuznetsov carries no fixed-wing airborne early warning aircraft. That role is filled by Ko-31 helicopters. She also lacks the dedicated electronic warfare and carrier-based support aircraft typical on U.S. carriers. Yet she can perform air superiority, fleet defense, air support, direct fire support for amphibious assaults, reconnaissance and naval mine deployment. Complementing her air wing, Kuznetsov is armed with a dozen P-70 Granite long-range anti-ship cruise missiles. Kuznetsov received her air wing by 1993 and carried out her first Mediterranean deployment from late 1995 to early 1996, officially becoming the Navy's flagship. She was immobilized for overhaul and returned to service in 1998. But her operational history has been marked by incidents and aircraft accidents. In September 2005, an Su-33 slid off her deck into the Atlantic. After modernization, she returned to service in 2006. In the 2010s, she led a squadron to the naval facility in though Russian officials downplayed any direct link to Syrian operations. In 2016, Kuznetsov deployed to the Syrian theater and was escorted by an ocean tug because of concerns about propulsion reliability. Her air group typically included Su-33 fighters, MiG-29K multi-role jets, Ka-52K navalized attack helicopters, Ko-31 AEW helicopters, and Ko-27 search and rescue helicopters. Analysts noted a shortage of adequately trained pilots, which limited the number of fixed-wing sorties. During the deployment, a MiG-29K crashed on takeoff. And later, an Su-33 was lost when arresting cables failed to stop a landing. Those problems forced much of the strike effort to shift to land-based aircraft. Kuznetsov's chronic problems especially with propulsion, have made sustaining the carrier difficult, and there are no immediate plans for a successor. She has been undergoing phased refurbishments and upgrades since 2018, including replacement of boilers. The refit schedule slipped repeatedly. A dock accident involving the PD-50 dry dock forced a reorientation of repair plans and extended timelines. United Shipbuilding Corporation officials later said dock repairs were nearly complete and confirmed that work on Kuznetsov was expected to finish in 2024. With the planned updates, the improved heavy aircraft carrying cruiser is expected to regain much of her combat potential, and the Russian Navy hopes she can remain in service for another 10 to 15 years.